Welcome back to your online lectures for Basics of Spaceflight. We're ready now to talk about Chapter 9. This is the next to the last chapter in the textbook, and it has to do with the topic of space commercialization. So, what is space commercialization? We're talking about the use of equipment and or spacecraft that are sent into outer space in order to provide goods and services that are of commercial value. Some examples of space commercialization include the satellite industry and also private launch systems, including space tourism. By far, the satellite industry is the number one on the market, and within that industry, satellite services are the largest and most profitable sector within the satellite industry. So you can see, for example, in this breakdown that money is spent not just to manufacture the satellites, but also to launch them, to maintain the ground equipment, but also to provide servicing such as television, radio, cellular, and other sorts of networks. So, a little bit about the history of satellite services. If you think back to the beginning of the semester, we talked about the first artificial satellite that was launched by the Russians called Sputnik in the 1950s. And later on, about a decade later, came the first commercial communications satellite, commercial meaning not paid for by a nation, and that is the Telstar 1, which was launched in 1962. There's an overview here if you click on this link of the satellites, satellite history, and so on, where you can learn more details. But as of today, there are over 60 countries that have operated artificial satellites. Many of these have their own launcher, and if they don't, they can be launched from a foreign launcher. So, commercial satellites not only provide the things that you might think of initially, like television and radio, but also things like mobile and portable devices, connectivity among business applications, and also things such as weather data collection, navigation, transportation, and so on. So the satellites provide a lot of different services that we use every day without even thinking about it. Every time you ping something on your satellite, you are essentially using everything. Every time you ping something, on your cell phone, you're using a satellite to do that. Okay, so I want to talk about the less profitable side of things, which are the private space flight. This is still a big player in the game. Because of the fact that initially, when the space race began and nations were getting their space flight underway, the nations were the ones, their governments were the ones to build the rockets and engage in the space flight. And it wasn't until they started subcontracting to private industry that private spaceflight came to be a thing. And now, at this point, commercial companies launch space flight rockets and other parts into space completely on their own. So when did this all begin? If we go as far back as 1982, we come to the first private space launch that was privately funded. This was for a weaponry purpose. This was the Conestoga 1 that was launched in 1982, and it was armed with intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. This only one of the three attempts was successful, and this was eventually a project that was discontinued. And after that time, eventually private ventures got to become involved in launching to orbit. The Pegasus, which is an ongoing company that launches things into orbit does so from an air to launch orbit, like we talked about when we were talking about orbital trajectories. So in 1990 is when this first started, and that first launch was basically just to send a small satellite into orbit, low Earth orbit, and it's since been continuing to provide this kind of service to NASA, for example, to launch satellites into orbit. There's, by the way, a reflection of the 16 years of Pegasus. I think it's actually more than that now. If you click on this YouTube link, you can hear a little bit more of the history there. Okay, so what about crewed private space flight? This began in around 2004 with Spaceship One/White Knight, which was done by the Mojave Aerospace Ventures. This was also an air launch to orbit kind of flight, but this was suborbital. So, unlike the Pegasus, where we're launching satellites into orbit, this is just a suborbital space flight whose mission profile looks something like this. You're essentially just launching, poking up into outer space. So the aircraft kind of allows you to then launch from a higher altitude, and you're poking up into space and then returning. Okay, so this Mojave Aerospace Ventures is a company that was founded by co-founders Paul Allen and Burt Rutan. And there is a documentary about their involvement here in the link below that you can learn about how Mojave Aerospace Ventures came into being. But essentially, one of their big claims to fame was this winning of the Sansari Prize, which was worth $10 million, and it was won by the Spaceship One/White Knight pilot, Mike Melville, who became the first commercial astronaut. So you're only called an astronaut if you make it past the Kármán line into official outer space, and that had only been done so previously by astronauts that were funded by government agencies such as NASA. So with spaceflight, with Spaceship One White Knight in 2004, Mike Melville became the first commercial astronaut. And so you can learn a little bit more about that in the YouTube link provided. Okay, then there is the market of space tourism, which is really just in an embryonic stage at this point, but we may as well talk about it. So there's a couple players in the game here. One is Virgin Galactic. This was a company founded by Sir Richard Branson in 2004. And its mission is to provide space tourism and satellite launches. And so the Spaceship Two/White Knight, you could think about this almost like a spin-off that was inspired by the Spaceship One. This idea was to send people willing to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars into space. Some famous people were said to have bought tickets, but the test flight in 2014 actually was a failure and killed a pilot, and it was determined that this was a pilot error. So a replacement ship, the VSS Unity, was successfully launched into suborbital outer space with just a crew of 2 pilots in 2018, whose names are listed here. Since then, in 2019, Virgin Galactic has announced that it's going to partner with Under Armour, and they are still trying to plan, I suppose, the launch for Richard Branson to actually go out into outer space. It was originally planned for late 2019, but since things have been a little bit hectic since then, I don't know exactly when that's thought to be going to happen. Another case study to look at is the SpaceX company, which is owned by Elon Musk, which I'm sure you've all heard of. This is also the guy that is behind the Tesla organization of electric car building, and the SpaceX developed this rocket, the Falcon, and there have been different generations of Falcon. The first one was Falcon 1, a two-stage rocket. And at this point, we're up to Falcon 9, Falcon 9 and Heavy Falcon. Falcon 9 was able to reach orbit and dock with the International Space Station in 2012. And Falcon Heavy has got a few launches in. This is going to be ultimately replaced by the Starship, which is in development still, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the Falcon Heavy is, as the name implies, heavier than was the Falcon 9, which I guess I don't have the actual size of here. Maybe it's this 670 kilograms. Falcon Heavy is a lot more, and it includes both the Falcon 9 core plus strap-on boosters. As you can see, the strap-on boosters are the side-by-side boosters, sort of like the space shuttle that we talked about before. Okay, this Falcon Heavy is, was originally planned to fly to the moon and or provide interplanetary missions. That has since been scrapped, and these kind of goals are going to be taken on by the Starship project. So speaking of, what about private spaceflight to the moon? Well, there have been some commercial robotic flybys that have taken place. There have been attempts to land on the moon with a robot. The Google put out what they called the X Prize, which was going to be $30 million to someone who could land a robot on the moon and meet the goals that they had set forth. When it became clear that nobody was going to be able to do that, the prize was essentially considered to be unclaimed. In 2019, though, the Space IL crash landed, sort of crashed while attempting to land on the moon, and so the X Prize did award $1 million to them for actually touching the surface, even though it didn't really attain all the goals. Human lunar flyby proposals have been tossed around. At first, it looked as though this Deep Space Expedition Alpha had a firm plan in mind, but at this point, there's no set launch date anymore. It was first said to be 2015, then pushed back to 2018, and since that time, any specific date has been removed from their website, and it's unclear what the plan is. Probably they might not have anything in the immediate future that they think they can do. If you want to talk about private space flight beyond the moon, this is getting back to this SpaceX Starship that Elon Musk is in the process of developing. There have been other talks of flying beyond the moon. Dennis Tito, who came up with the Inspiration Mars Foundation, had ideas to send people to Mars. This is a now defunct organization. Others have talked about the idea of mining on asteroids. There's a lot of technical and profit questions that go along with that, but all of this is basically from here down is either defunct or speculative, but the Starship is something that is in production or in development right now. Okay, so that is a brief summary of Chapter 9. There's a lot more details in the text that you can read. I would also encourage you to do some Google searching because the text, even though it was a pretty recent textbook, is quickly becoming out of date given how rapidly things are developing in the private sector when it comes to space commercialization. So go ahead and just Google things, look on Wikipedia to see if you can find more recent information on some of the things mentioned in the textbook. I've tried to highlight some of the things that I know are out of date, but hopefully you can take the time to do that. And our next lecture will be about chapter 10, and that will basically finish up the textbook. Thank you very much. Talk to you again.